Hey everybody, this is Mr. James, and in this video we're going to be talking about conditional statements. So in the last video we talked about inductive and deductive reasoning, how to use patterns and logic to come to some sort of conclusion. In this video we're going to learn how to do that a little bit more, but to use more precise language, okay, conditional statements. So first we'll talk about what a conditional statement is. So all a conditional statement is the statement with an if and a then. Okay? We call the if part the hypothesis, okay? And we call the then part the conclusion. So in this sentence I have right here, it says, if Mr. James does not sleep, then he'll be angry the next day. So the hypothesis is if Mr. James does not sleep, sometimes called a premise, and the conclusion is then he'll be angry the next day. Oftentimes, conditional statements or if-then statements have some sort of cause and effect. So if Mr. James does not sleep, that's your cause or hypothesis. Then he'll be angry the next day, that's your effect, that's your conclusion. But not always, right? Like if we look at this next one, whales live in the ocean. How would I write that as an if-then statement? How would I do that? Well, here's what I would do. I would write if it's a whale, okay, it's my if, and my then would be then it lives in the ocean. And if you don't have two different colors to write with, that's okay. Just underline the hypothesis, and maybe do a little wavy underline of the conclusion, so we know the difference between those two. And if you're not using colors, do the same thing up top, so we can tell the difference. All right. At this point, try and pause the video and write an if-then statement for the next two phrases. Go ahead and pause the video now. Alright, so hopefully you've tried the next two, and they're a little tricky. All fruits are foods. I would say if it's a fruit, then, oh, gotta change my color, then it's a food. Okay? This one's tricky because it says all fruits are foods. But we can say that if something is a fruit, then it's also a food. Okay? So there's our if-then statement. And the last one, don't touch the stove if it's hot. This one's a little confusing because the if is right here. If it's hot. Right? So we can think of cause and effect. If the stove is hot, then you shouldn't touch it. So we're actually going to reverse this one. Okay? And the way we know that is because it's if is coming at the end of the sentence. So if you see that, you know you got to reverse it. So if the stove is hot, that's our hypothesis, then don't touch it. Okay, if the stove is hot, then don't touch it. Okay, so those are conditional statements. If-then statements with a hypothesis and a conclusion. Not too bad. Okay? You can change any of the statements or conjectures, theorems we've had so far into conditional statements. So any conjecture or theorem can be written as a conditional statement, and we'll practice that a little more in class. For now, we're going to keep going and talk about some types of conditional statements. We have four basic kinds of conditional statements. The regular conditional, a converse, an inverse, and a contrapositive. Okay? Let's talk about what those mean. A conditional statement is just what we were talking about before. We've got hypothesis, like if it's a whale, and our conclusion, then it lives in the ocean. Okay? And we can write a little shorthand for that. We use the letter P to denote the hypothesis. So over here with the special logic symbols, that's right, that's the hypothesis. Okay, hypothesis. And we can use this little arrow here, okay, kind of an equal sign with a little arrow on the end, to mean then. Okay, and then we use the letter Q to denote the conclusion. Okay, the conclusion. Okay, so if it's a whale, that's our P, our hypothesis. Then, okay, then that's our arrow. It lives in the ocean. That's our Q. Okay, and why would we bother writing down this kind of shorthand? Well, it helps us see what a converse, inverse, and contrapositive are. Okay? A converse takes the original conditional statement and switches the hypothesis and the conclusion. Okay? So instead of if it's a whale, then it lives in the ocean, the converse reads if it lives in the ocean, then it is a whale. Okay? It's switching that hypothesis and the conclusion. So we could write Q, then P. Okay? That's telling us that Q, the conclusion, is coming first, and P, the hypothesis, is coming second after the then. Okay? One way to remember that actually Ms. Pierce told me was that if you think of Converse shoes, right? You got your Converse shoes here, okay? Okay, Converse shoes, okay? And you cross your feet, right? It's kind of like switching the hypothesis and the conclusion, okay? So that was for Ms. Pierce. You can use that one if you want, or you can just remember that converse is a switch. It's switching the hypothesis and the conclusion. What about an inverse? Okay. Well, an inverse is the same as a conditional, except it's got this extra word, these nots. Okay. So an inverse reads, if it is not a whale, okay, then it does not live in the ocean. Those are called negations or nots. Okay. And in this little shorthand over here, not uses this little squiggly line, this little tilde. So that's going to be not. Okay. So we would say not P for not a whale. Then it is not Q. Okay. So this is just saying that an inverse puts not in front of the hypothesis, then not in front of the conclusion. That's all that's saying. And the last one, the contrapositive, does both. Okay, it switches the hypothesis and the conclusion, and put nots in front of them. Okay, so this one would read, if it does not live in the ocean, okay, pay attention to those nots. Okay, then, okay, there's our arrow. It is not a whale. Again, we've got the not. So in our logic or conditional shorthand, we would write not Q to show that we've switched the hypothesis and the conclusion, then not P. Okay. So again, we've got our conditional. We've got our converse that switches the hypothesis and the conclusion. We've got our inverse that negates or puts a not in front of the hypothesis and the conclusion. We've got the contrapositive that does both. It switches and it puts the not in front. We've got one other kind of conditional. It's called a biconditional. Okay? A biconditional has our hypothesis and our conclusion, and it uses this phrase, if and only if. Okay? If and only if. And that phrase is meant to show that, well, let me just read it. If it is a whale, it is a whale if and only if it lives in the ocean. That means that this is no longer cause and effect. That means that it is a whale if it lives in the ocean, but also this goes backwards. If it lives in the ocean, it is a whale. So biconditional kind of combines our regular conditional and our converse, okay, into one phrase that's kind of meant to go in both directions. If it's a whale, or it is a whale if and only if it lives in the ocean. I'll talk about biconditionals a little more in class, but for now, this is how we write out the shorthand for a biconditional. The P, remember, the hypothesis, it is a whale. If and only if uses this two arrows. So over here it is if and only if. Okay, and then the conclusion Q. It lives in the ocean. Okay, so there's a biconditional going both ways. Right? At this point, I'd like you to try and actually write out your own converse, inverse, contrapositive, and biconditional. So take a look at the bottom. Pause the video here. Try and write out a converse, inverse, contrapositive, and biconditional for the statement up top. If two lines are perpendicular, then they form a 90-degree angle. In fact, let me just underline. There's your hypothesis, and there's your conclusion. Okay? So pause the video here and give that a try. And the answers are going to pop up right. And there they are. So, quick review. The converse, we've switched the hypothesis to the conclusion. Their perpendiculars at the end, and two lines forming 90-degree angles up front. One thing to note is that I kept the word two lines form at the beginning. That's kind of the subject, and it wouldn't make sense to switch them. Okay, so after you're done with these sentences, you kind of have to read it again to make sure it's grammatically correct, right? If I said something like, if they form a 90-degree angle, then two lines are perpendicular, it doesn't quite make sense because I've got an if at the beginning and I don't know what it's talking about, so I'll leave that up front. For my inverse, remember, I'm adding these knots, okay? I've got this not perpendicular, and they do not form a 90-degree angle. Again, you've got to look at the grammar to make sure it's all right. In the contrapositive, I'm adding the knots, okay? And I'm also switching the hypothesis and the conclusion, okay? So there's your conclusion up front, and there's the perpendicular, our original hypothesis. And in the biconditional, I keep my hypothesis conclusion, and I add this if and only if. Okay? So correct your paper. If it's not quite like this, feel free to underline things to help you out. And let's flip the page over when you're done.